Hey, what up? They say they going to block, it's time to slide. Hey, little bit walking up, bad stuff, suited up. Like, fuck, we ain't never playing forever and always in the streets, ho.
Oh yeah, bar, you say.
Oh yeah, the Equinox.
An 18-year-old girl breaks into a house with a loaded gun. She finds her 33-year-old boyfriend in bed with another woman. Minutes later, she's dying on the floor from a gunshot wound. But here's what doesn't make sense. Her gun was never fired. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most controversial cases to emerge from Indiana this year. A case where the age gap alone should have raised red flags, where social media posts after a death sparked outrage, where a young mother's life ended in a bedroom that wasn't hers, holding a weapon she never used. This isn't your typical domestic dispute gone wrong. This is a story about power, manipulation, and what happens when a teenager gets trapped in a relationship with someone who's lived twice as long as she has. The person who pulled the trigger that night claims it was self-defense. They say they had no choice. But when you hear what investigators uncovered about the relationship, about the manipulation, about what really happened in those final moments, you might question everything about that claim. We're going to walk through this case step by step, because the more you learn about what led to that deadly night, the more disturbing it becomes. This isn't just about a love triangle gone wrong. It's about grooming, control, and a justice system trying to determine whether a killing was justified or whether it was murder disguised as self-defense. By the end of tonight's episode, you'll understand why this case has divided communities, why family members are demanding justice, and why some are calling this a perfect example of what happens when we ignore the warning signs of predatory relationships. But we're not starting there. We're starting with who this 18-year-old really was before she became a headline. Because understanding her story, her dreams, her struggles, her attempts to break free, that's what makes this case so heartbreaking. Before we continue, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from tonight. And here's something we want you to think about as we go through this case. At what point should friends and family intervene when they see someone they love in a relationship that seems wrong? Your thoughts might spark important conversations in the comments. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about self-defense, age gaps in relationships, and who really deserves protection under the law. Let's begin with a young woman whose life was just getting started and discover how she ended up in the most dangerous situation imaginable. Her name was Shamiya Ny'Air Allen, and if you had met her just 2 years ago, you would have sworn she had the world figured out. Born on Valentine's Day 2006, Shamia was the kind of teenager who seemed to have an old soul. While most kids her age were worried about homework and weekend plans, she was already building a career. She had steady employment at Olive Garden, where co-workers remember her as reliable and hardworking. But her real passion lay in tattoo artistry. She had natural talent with a needle, creating designs that impressed even experienced artists twice her age. At just 18, Shamia was already a mother to a little boy named Future. Those who knew her say motherhood brought out the best in her. She was completely devoted to her son, working extra shifts to ensure he had everything he needed. Her family watched her balance work, artistry, and parenting with admiration. They called her their baby girl princess, and her mother often referred to her as my mini-me. To her family, Shamia seemed to have inherited all the best qualities. She was outgoing, affectionate, and had this ability to light up any room she entered. Her laugh was infectious. Her sense of style was bold and confident. When she walked into family gatherings, everyone gravitated toward her energy. But sometime around her 16th birthday, those closest to Shamia began noticing changes. At first they were subtle. She became more secretive about where she was going and who she was spending time with. Phone calls that used to happen openly in the living room were now taken behind closed doors. Family dinners, where she used to be the center of attention, became occasions where she seemed distracted, checking her phone constantly. Her mother and sisters started asking questions. Who was this new person in her life? Why was Shamia suddenly so guarded about her relationships? But Shamia would brush off their concerns with teenage responses. She was old enough to make her own decisions. She could handle her own problems. She didn't need anyone telling her what to do. The changes became more pronounced as months passed. Shamia's typically confident demeanor started showing cracks. There were days when she seemed on edge, easily frustrated by things that never used to bother her. Her family noticed she was having more arguments, more emotional outbursts over seemingly small issues. Then came the incident that truly alarmed everyone who loved her. In September 2024, Shamia was arrested and charged with misdemeanor domestic battery and criminal mischief. The charges indicated she had damaged someone's property and engaged in a physical altercation during what police classified as a domestic dispute. For a young woman who had never been in trouble with law enforcement, this was completely out of character. Her family was shocked. This wasn't the Shamia they knew. She had always been passionate, yes, but never violent, never destructive. The arrest suggested she had reached some kind of breaking point, but she refused to discuss the details with anyone. When family members tried to understand what had happened, Shamia would become defensive. She insisted she could handle whatever was going on in her life. She was an adult now, she reminded them. She had a child to think about. She didn't need their interference. But her loved ones could see the toll something was taking on her. The vibrant teenager who used to share everything with her family had become guarded and isolated. The confident young woman who seemed to have her life together was clearly struggling with something she wouldn't or couldn't talk about. By December 2024, Shamia was briefly booked into jail related to those September charges. Her family watched helplessly as the young woman they adored seemed to be caught in a cycle of problems she refused to let them help her solve. What made this especially heartbreaking was watching someone with so much potential, a talented artist, a devoted mother, a beloved daughter and sister, gradually becoming someone they barely recognized. The Shamia who used to confide in her family about everything had built walls they couldn't break through. Those who knew her best could sense that whatever was happening in her private life was destroying the person they loved. But Shamia remained determined to handle things on her own terms, even as those around her watched her struggle with something that seemed far bigger than she was equipped to manage. Looking back now, her family realizes they were watching someone trapped in a situation she couldn't escape, fighting battles she couldn't win, all while trying to maintain the facade that everything was under control. What they didn't know yet was just how dangerous that situation had become. The person responsible for those changes in Shamia's life had a name, Brian Jackson. And when you learn about Brian Jackson, everything about Shamia's transformation starts to make sense. Jackson was 33 years old when he first entered Shamia's world. She was 16. And think about that for a moment. When Shamia was learning to drive and figuring out what colleges she might want to attend, Brian Jackson was a grown man who had already lived nearly twice as long as she had. He had years of experience manipulating situations to his advantage. He understood how to read people, how to identify their vulnerabilities, how to make them dependent on his approval. Shamia at 16 was exactly the kind of target predators like Jackson seek out. She was mature for her age, working and taking on adult responsibilities. She was beautiful, talented, and confident enough to seem independent. But underneath that confidence was still a teenager who craved validation and had no experience recognizing manipulation when it was happening to her. Jackson didn't approach this relationship like a normal romantic connection. This was grooming, plain and simple. He started by making Shamia feel special, chosen, more mature than other girls her age. He probably told her she was different, that she understood him in ways others couldn't. He made her feel like their age difference didn't matter because she was so advanced, so ready for an adult relationship. What Shamia didn't realize was that Jackson had no intention of giving her the exclusive, committed relationship she thought she was entering. Jackson lived what he called a polyamorous lifestyle, which was really just his way of justifying having multiple women in his life while demanding total loyalty from each of them. This wasn't ethical polyamory, where all parties consent to the arrangement. This was manipulation disguised as progressive thinking. Jackson expected Shamia to accept that he had other lovers, including at least one woman he was married to or seriously involved with. Meanwhile, he demanded complete devotion from Shamia and became possessive and controlling when she showed interest in anyone else. For a teenager who had entered what she thought was a committed relationship, this revelation was devastating. Jackson had essentially trapped her. She was already emotionally invested, already dependent on his approval, already isolated from friends and family who might have helped her see the situation clearly. The psychological impact on Shamia was immediate and severe. She found herself constantly competing for Jackson's attention and affection. She was forced to share the man she loved with other women, knowing that at any moment he might choose someone else over her. The emotional chaos this created would have been difficult for an experienced adult to handle, let alone a teenager. Jackson used classic manipulation tactics to maintain control. He would shower Shamia with attention and affection when she accepted his terms, then withdraw that attention when she questioned the arrangement. He made her feel like she was being unreasonable or immature when she expressed hurt about his other relationships. He convinced her that if she truly loved him, she would accept his lifestyle choices. The power imbalance in this relationship was staggering. Jackson had financial resources Shamia lacked. He had life experience she didn't possess. He had emotional manipulation skills she had no defense against. Most importantly, he had the ability to walk away from their relationship without losing anything significant, while Shamia felt like she would lose everything if he left her. As months turned into years, this dynamic destroyed Shamia's sense of self-worth. She began to believe that she had to earn Jackson's love through compliance and acceptance of whatever he demanded. She started to see his other relationships not as betrayals, but as competitions she needed to win. We want to pause here for a moment and ask you something important. What would you do if you discovered your partner was involved with multiple other people after they had led you to believe you were in an exclusive relationship? Let us know in the comments below. And if this case is opening your eyes to red flags in relationships, make sure to subscribe because we dive deep into cases like this one that expose dangerous patterns of behavior. By late 2024 and early 2025, the strain of this arrangement had pushed Shamia to her breaking point multiple times. She was exhausted from the constant emotional turmoil. She was tired of sharing the father of her child with other women. She was desperate for the exclusive commitment Jackson had implied he would eventually give her, but which never seemed to materialize. Jackson, meanwhile, showed no signs of changing his behavior. If anything, he seemed to enjoy the drama and competition between the women in his life. He appeared to take pleasure in having multiple people fighting for his attention, validating his sense of power and desirability. Friends and family members who witnessed Shamia during this period describe a young woman who was being systematically destroyed by someone who claimed to love her. They watched her confidence erode, her happiness disappear, her bright future dim as she became increasingly obsessed with winning a game that was rigged against her from the start. The relationship had become a cycle of hope and devastation. Jackson would promise changes that never came. He would suggest that maybe, eventually, he might be ready for exclusivity. He would dangle the possibility of commitment just enough to keep Shamia invested, then pull it away when she got too comfortable. What made this especially cruel was that Jackson seemed to understand exactly how much power he held over Shamia. He knew she was young, inexperienced, and emotionally dependent on him. He knew she had a child who she believed was his, making it even harder for her to walk away. He knew she had isolated herself from family and friends who might have helped her escape. But on January 29th, 2025, something happened that shattered even Shamia's ability to accept Jackson's betrayals. She discovered him in bed with another woman. Not just texting someone else, not just having dinner with someone else, not just maintaining one of his other relationships at a distance. She found him physically intimate with another woman, in what she had considered their space during what should have been their time together. For someone who had already endured years of sharing the person she loved, walking in on this scene was the final destruction of any illusion she might have maintained about their relationship. Shamia left Jackson's house that day, carrying more than heartbreak. She was carrying a rage that had been building for years, a sense of betrayal that went beyond anything she had experienced before, and a gun that she was prepared to use. What happened next would determine whether Shamia would finally break free from Jackson's control or whether her attempt to confront him would cost her everything. Evening was settling over Anderson, Indiana, when Shamia made the decision that would end her life. She returned to Jackson's house on the 2400 block of Lincoln Street around 8:30 p.m., but this wasn't the same vulnerable teenager who had left earlier that day. This was someone who had reached the end of her ability to tolerate betrayal. Someone who had spent hours processing what she had witnessed, letting anger replace the hurt that had controlled her for so long. Shamia came back armed. She had made a conscious decision to bring a handgun with her. Whether she intended to use it as a threat, for protection, or something worse, we may never know. But the presence of that weapon transformed what might have been another painful confrontation into a deadly encounter. When Shamia arrived at Jackson's residence, she didn't knock. She didn't wait for permission to enter. According to witness accounts that would later be given to police, she forced her way into the house without authorization. The door showed evidence of being broken or damaged during her entry. This wasn't someone asking to talk things through. This was someone taking control of a situation where she had felt powerless for too long. Inside that house, Jackson was still with the same woman Shamia had discovered him with earlier. Neither of them was expecting Shamia to return, and certainly not in the state she was in. The woman who had been intimate with Jackson suddenly found herself face to face with his teenage girlfriend, who was now holding a firearm and consumed with rage. What happened next unfolded rapidly, but the sequence of events would become crucial to understanding who was really responsible for what followed. Witnesses inside the house, specifically the woman who had been with Jackson, later told police that Shamia entered the residence while visibly upset and carrying the gun. According to their account, Shamia began threatening both of them, making it clear that she blamed not just Jackson for the betrayal, but also the woman who had been willing to sleep with him. The confrontation quickly became physical. Reports suggest that Shamia lunged at the other woman, engaging in a violent struggle. This wasn't just angry words or accusations. This was a physical assault driven by months of accumulated rage and humiliation. It was during this chaotic scene that someone inside the house managed to call 911. The call came in at approximately 8:30 p.m., with the caller reporting that an 18-year-old had arrived at the location armed with a firearm. The dispatcher could hear shouting and commotion in the background, making it clear that this was an active, dangerous situation requiring immediate police response. But Jackson wasn't just standing by watching this confrontation unfold. According to the accounts given to police, he intervened in the struggle between Shamia and the other woman. However, his intervention didn't involve trying to de-escalate the situation or calm Shamia down. Instead, Jackson retrieved his own firearm. What happened in those next few moments would be disputed later, but the outcome was undeniable. A gunshot rang out through the house, loud enough that neighbors later reported hearing it from their own homes. When the sound faded, Shamia was on the floor with a critical gunshot wound. Anderson police officers were already racing to the scene when the shot was fired. They had been dispatched immediately after the 911 call came in, understanding that a domestic situation involving firearms required urgent response. When they arrived at Jackson's house just minutes later, they found a scene of chaos and conflicting stories. Shamia was lying on the floor, critically injured from a single gunshot wound. Blood was spreading around her as she struggled to breathe. Jackson and the other woman were both present, both claiming that Shamia had been the aggressor, both insisting that the shooting had been necessary to stop her attack. Paramedics arrived shortly after the police, working frantically to stabilize Shamia for transport to the hospital. They performed emergency treatment at the scene before rushing her to the nearest trauma center. But even as they worked on her, it was clear that her injuries were severe. Jackson immediately began telling his version of events to the responding officers. He claimed that Shamia had broken into his house with the intention of harming both him and his companion. He insisted that she had threatened to kill them both, that she had attacked the other woman violently, and that he had been forced to defend himself and his companion by shooting Shamia. According to Jackson's account, he had feared for their lives and had no choice but to use lethal force to stop Shamia's assault. He portrayed himself as the victim of a home invasion by an unstable teenager who had come to his house intent on violence. The other woman corroborated Jackson's basic story, confirming that Shamia had broken in armed and angry, that she had physically attacked her, and that Jackson had intervened to protect them both. But even as Jackson was giving his statement to police, there were details about the scene that didn't quite align with his version of events. Officers noticed inconsistencies that would become important as the investigation progressed. For several hours, Shamia fought for her life in the hospital. Doctors and nurses worked to save the young woman who had come to Jackson's house seeking confrontation and instead found herself dying from a gunshot wound. But their efforts weren't enough. In the early morning hours of January 30th, 2025, Shamiya Ny'Air Allen was pronounced dead. She was 18 years old, a mother to a toddler who would now grow up without her, a daughter whose family would never hold her again. Brian Jackson's claim of self-defense had resulted in the death of the teenager he had been involved with for 2 years. The woman who had loved him, competed for him, and ultimately confronted him about his betrayals was gone. But as investigators began processing the crime scene and examining the evidence, questions started emerging about whether Jackson's version of events was the whole truth. Because sometimes, the physical evidence tells a different story than the one the survivors want police to believe. While Brian Jackson was painting himself as a victim who had narrowly escaped death, forensic investigators were methodically collecting evidence that would tell a very different story. The first major discovery came when crime scene technicians examined Shamia's handgun, despite Jackson's claims that she had threatened to kill him and his companion, despite his insistence that he feared for their lives, despite his assertion that he had no choice but to shoot in self-defense. Shamia's weapon revealed a startling truth. Her gun had never been fired. Not only had no bullets been discharged from Shamia's firearm, but a full magazine of ammunition remained loaded inside it. The safety was off, indicating she may have been prepared to use it, but the forensic evidence was clear. Shamiya Allen had not fired a single shot during the confrontation that cost her life. This discovery immediately called Jackson's self-defense narrative into question. If Shamia hadn't actually shot at anyone, what exactly had Jackson been defending himself against? The presence of an unfired weapon suggested threat and intimidation, not active deadly force requiring an immediate lethal response. Ballistics experts then turned their attention to the bullet that had killed Shamia. The trajectory analysis and powder residue patterns painted a troubling picture. The shot had been fired at relatively close range, but the angle and forensic evidence suggested this wasn't a bullet fired during an active struggle where Jackson was fighting for control of a weapon. Instead, the evidence indicated that Jackson had enough time and distance to aim and fire deliberately. The forensic findings were inconsistent with a split-second defensive reaction to immediate mortal danger. They were more consistent with someone who had gained control of the situation and made a conscious decision to pull the trigger. Even more damaging to Jackson's credibility was what happened after Shamia died. While her family was planning a funeral and grieving the loss of their beloved daughter, Jackson made a social media post that shocked the community. According to multiple witnesses who screenshot the content before it was deleted, Jackson appeared to be bragging about the deadly outcome of the confrontation. The post seemed to suggest that Jackson was proud that 2 women had literally fought over him, with one dying as a result. Community members who saw the content described it as Jackson boasting about someone being deceased over him. A callous display that painted him not as a traumatized survivor, but as someone who took perverse satisfaction in the tragic ending of his love triangle. This social media activity was completely inconsistent with someone who had reluctantly taken a life in self-defense. It suggested someone who felt vindicated rather than remorseful, someone who saw Shamiya's death as a victory rather than a tragedy. As investigators dug deeper into the timeline and Jackson's statements, additional inconsistencies emerged. Details about the sequence of events didn't align with the physical evidence. Jackson's description of feeling threatened didn't match the forensic reconstruction of what had actually occurred in that bedroom. Detectives also began examining the background of Jackson's relationship with Shamia, discovering the pattern of manipulation and control that had characterized their interaction for 2 years. This provided a clear motive. Jackson had been losing control over Shamia, and her discovery of his infidelity represented a threat to the power dynamic he had carefully constructed. The investigation revealed that this wasn't a case of a homeowner defending himself against a dangerous intruder. This was the culmination of a relationship where an older man had systematically manipulated a teenager, and when that teenager finally reached her breaking point and confronted him, he chose to silence her permanently. Community reaction was swift and severe. Local residents, who learned about the case, began calling Jackson a predator and demanding justice for Shamia. The age gap that had been present throughout their relationship now looked even more problematic in light of how it had ended. Within days of completing their initial forensic analysis, Anderson police made their move. Brian Jackson was formally arrested and charged with murder in the death of Shamiya Ny'Air Allen. The self-defense claim that he had hoped would protect him had crumbled under scientific scrutiny. The Madison County District Attorney's Office announced that Jackson would face second-degree murder charges, indicating that prosecutors believed this was an intentional killing, rather than a justified defensive action. Additional charges related to firearm use during the commission of a felony were also filed. Jackson's arrest brought some measure of relief to Shamiya's grieving family, but they knew the legal battle was just beginning. The evidence might have exposed Jackson's lies, but securing a conviction would require proving those lies to a jury beyond reasonable doubt. The case that Jackson thought he could control through manipulation and false narratives was now in the hands of the justice system. As of today, Brian Jackson remains behind bars awaiting trial. A Madison County judge denied him bail, determining that he poses too significant a risk to the community to be released while his case proceeds through the court system. Jackson has entered a plea of not guilty, maintaining his self-defense claim despite the forensic evidence that contradicts his story. Legal experts familiar with the case suggest that if convicted of second-degree murder, Jackson faces a potential sentence of 45 to 65 years in prison. For Shamiya's family, nothing less than the maximum penalty will represent true justice. They want to ensure that Jackson can never manipulate another young woman the way he manipulated their daughter. The trial is expected to take place in late 2025 or early 2026, and Shamiya's loved ones plan to fill every available seat in the courtroom. They wear pink, Shamiya's favorite color, to each hearing, creating a sea of support that serves as a visual reminder of who this case is really about. But for Shamiya's family, legal justice is only one part of honoring her memory. They have established a fund in Shamiya's name to support her son's future's education and to help other young mothers escape abusive relationships. They want to transform their personal tragedy into something that can protect other families from experiencing similar loss. Shamiya's mother continues to celebrate her daughter's life on social media, using hashtags like #LongLiveShamia to keep her memory alive. On what would have been Shamiya's 19th birthday, the family organized a balloon release where friends and relatives shared positive memories rather than focusing solely on how her life ended. The case has sparked important conversations in Anderson and beyond about age gap relationships and the vulnerability of teenagers who become involved with significantly older partners. Local advocacy groups have used Shamiya's story to push for better education in schools about recognizing unhealthy relationship dynamics. Perhaps most importantly, Shamiya's story has become a cautionary tale about the importance of trusting instincts when something feels wrong about a loved one's relationship. Her family now encourages others to speak up when they notice concerning changes in someone they care about, even when that person insists they don't need help. The red flags were there from the beginning. The age difference, the secrecy, the personality changes, the legal troubles. But like many families, Shamiya's loved ones struggled with how to intervene in the life of someone who was technically an adult, even though she was still emotionally and psychologically vulnerable. Today, Little Future serves as a living reminder of his mother's love and potential. Shamiya's family is determined that he will grow up knowing how much his mother adored him, and how hard she fought to build a better life for both of them. Before we close, we want to ask you to do something important. If this case taught you something about recognizing dangerous relationships, hit that like button. If you think Shamiya's story needs to be shared to help protect other young women, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment below with words of support for Shamiya's family as they continue fighting for justice. Shamiya Ny'Air Allen's name is remembered not just for the tragedy of how her story ended, but as a call to action to protect others from walking the same dangerous path.